Last Blade 2 is my favorite fighting game of all time. A niche pick, I know, but it's got everything you need from a good fighting game. Sick combos, amazing visuals, character variety, well, I mean on a gameplay standpoint. I know half of these guys look like pretty generic samurai, but bear with me here. Quote-unquote tech, and a surprisingly interesting meter system, despite being a game from the 90s. You could definitely say that there are better meter systems out there, and yes, there definitely is, but I think there's something to be said about how this meter works for a few major reasons. 1. How you interact with the meter depends on what character you choose. This applies to pretty much any fighting game and depends on what your character's goals are, but in this game it's more so about how well your character can use each of the metered options. For example, Setsuna, my personal favorite character, is widely considered the worst character in speed, so Fandango is mostly out of the picture unless your name is Muli Bao Bao or Breathe. Not only that, but his SDM is also pretty trash. What good is Super Armor when you only have 25% health left? He usually ends up dying before it actually gets any use. Because these options are generally useless to him, Setsuna defaults to using normal supers and guard cancels exclusively, while the top tiers can usually find a way to make any option useful. With a few exceptions, of course. I'm looking at you, Amano. 2. How you interact also changes depending on which mode you choose. This is because each mode has different options that are available to them, and because how often those options are usable also differs. And 3. One of the game's most powerful defensive options is directly tied to the meter. Most fighting games use meter for specifically offensive purposes, minus the rare exceptions, but for the most part this holds true. In most games, you're mainly going to be using your meter for some sort of offensive action, whether it be EX moves, supers, DHCs, or ultimates. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but if you ask me, this can get pretty stale, because the choices I'm making are just varying levels of big move do big damage. In new games, I've seen attempts to have defensive mechanics that are tied to a resource, but they usually opt to tie those defensive options to a separate resource, and in doing so, reduces the amount of decision making. The games that do tie defensive options to the meter either make the defensive option really weak and most people forget that it exists outside of a few niche situations where it's optimal, or make it cost so little meter that you don't even really have to think about it. What Last Blade gets right is that both the defensive and offensive options that are given to you cost the same amount of meter, that being a full bar. The universal options are quite simple, a super which can be used infinitely under 25% health, and a guard cancel which is essentially a get off me tool with a pretty fat asterisk over it. For starters, it can only be used against a move which isn't bouncing, which is either kicks and jumping attacks assuming your opponent is using power, with a couple exceptions like most characters 4As, and requires full meter at all times. You may be wondering, if I can use supers infinitely when I'm under 25% health, I should only use guard cancels when my meter is full, and only use supers when I'm in desperation. And you wouldn't technically be wrong in saying that either, but this is where the decision making starts. Let's say that you're in a situation where your health is at about 30% and any full combo will probably kill you. The opponent is at about 60% health, and if you use your meter on a super combo, you can bring their health down to your level and make the game even, or you can play defensively and wait for the opponent to use a move that you can guard cancel. From there, you can use the opening it creates. In this situation, no answer is truly correct, and what you decide to do depends on what your priorities as a player are, as well as the habits of your opponent. If you're a more defensive player, and your reactions are good, then maybe you'll want to use the guard cancel strategy, or maybe you're an offensive player and you'd rather use the meter aggressively. Each of these options has a clear drawback. The super means that you no longer have use of your defensive option anymore, making your defense weaker overall, while the guard cancel potentially loses out on a hefty amount of damage and requires a successful mix-up to make up for it. These are the kind of decisions that define an individual's playstyle, and in my opinion, makes the game more fun, since it's more than just a response to the situation, it's an active choice that you can make. Things get even more interesting when we take into account the mode-specific options. Power and Speed have one extra option that requires a full meter no matter the situation. Power gets access to the Super Desperation moves, like I mentioned in my last video. These are especially powerful supers that can only be used with a full meter and below 25% health. The main use for these moves is to either even the playing field quickly, or to defeat an opponent when a super normally wouldn't. They also look really cool, and we all know that that's the most important part. Obviously, this is the most committal choice of the three, and if you miscalculate, you could be in a bad spot, because using a normal super would have preserved the meter for a potential guard cancel to protect yourself later, and with that gone, you end up being much weaker defensively. Even if it is the most committal option, it isn't always the incorrect one, and it could potentially pay off. So again, it's up to the player's choice if they want to risk being weaker later if it means they might be able to kill immediately. In speed, you gain access to Fandango, which, like I also said in the last video, is basically a 50-50. Its damage is also quite high, and in the mode with the lowest damage in the game, having a super which will deal about 50% one good interaction can be quite impactful, so it's definitely worth considering on offense. The main caveat is that most characters have to either parry an opponent and instantly use Fandango after to not get parried or countered themselves, or may have to use a reset and potentially lose out on a full combo to attempt a true 50-50. Losing the coin flip could also be a pretty big setback, especially because your meter building is slower in speed, so it's a big commitment as well. Finally, in EX, the decision making doesn't really change too much, but your meter building is extremely slow, so you have to be even more sure that your choice is going to pay off than the other two modes. Now, as you might have guessed, the difference in meter building between the modes is also a major influence on how you may decide to use your meter. Power players may be more inclined to use normal supers when their meter is full, because they deal lots of damage and have the fastest meter building of the three by quite a lot. In fact, power on average builds twice as much meter as speed, so in theory you'll be able to use twice as many metered options as speed. Speed players may be more inclined to use meter on guard cancels, since they're weaker defensively due to their worse frame data and by how easy they are to guard cancel as the defender. You may expect EX to follow the same strategy as speed, since they're also extremely weak defensively and have even worse meter building, but this actually ends up being the opposite. The best EX characters excel at cashing out their meter for massive damage, so they usually prefer to run a glass cannon approach instead to make up for all their weak points. Hell, the whole reason people run EX Amano is because he can and will kill you if he has meter. Now, of course, it doesn't end there, because how you go about building meter is also down to the player. Once again, I said in my last video that there are 3 ways to build meter: hitting an opponent, getting hit by an opponent, and attacking the opponent's block, with the exception of EX, who can't do that last one. But there's one more thing that I didn't mention, and that's whiffing specials. Generally, this isn't a super viable option because you can cover a lot of distance really quickly in this game using tech like hyper hops, but there are a few standout options that are actually used. The first is one that I've actually demonstrated in my last video, but didn't explicitly point out, and it's whiffed command grabs. The characters that can do this best are Kaede and Kagami. These two can either choose to OTG the opponent with 5B for the higher damage, or they can instead use 5C and cancel that into a command grab for more meter. It's a pretty small difference, but it can help. Amano can do something similar, but he uses his big swing special instead, because it's both faster to recover and gives more meter than his grab when cancelled. Using these to gain meter neutral is ill-advised, but if the opponent is exceptionally passive, you can get away with a couple freebies every now and then. Surprisingly enough though, that isn't the only meter trick that Amano has. He has a special taunt, which gives him half a bar of meter, and while this normally would never work, there's one specific situation where this is completely free to use. If Amano kills the opponent with his SDM, he has enough time to input his special taunt and gain half a bar in between rounds for free. This never really sees the light of day since Amano's SDM happens to kind of suck, but Kagami has a very similar technique that can actually be used in matches somewhat reliably. Kagami has a special move which he can hold to gain up to about 80% meter, and similarly, if he kills with a special cancelable move, he can perform the full charge as the opponent dies. There isn't really any drawback to using this, it just requires really good situational awareness on Kagami's part. Overall, I think there's a lot of nuance in how this meter is interacted with, despite the game's age, and it stands out from a lot of the other old fighting games. Of course, there are a couple more little things to talk about, like Akari's Talisman Special that costs a little bit of meter to use, or stuff like supers off command grabs, but generally those are either basically the same as regular supers, or generally not worth spending your meter on at all. What I think a lot of super meters are missing are multiple choices that cost a lot of meter to use, because then the decision you make with that resource becomes a lot more meaningful, since after you make that choice, you have to build all that meter back up. Too many fighting games make many options cost too little, or only have the choice of what super you're going to use. These simple or weighted choices usually lead to a game where one choice is almost always better than the other. Last Blade's meter managed to find a very good balance, where every option has its strengths and weaknesses, and while at the high level guard cancel tends to be the most common option used, it is by no means the only option, and that's the beauty of it. Even the characters who are known for usually focusing on meter for supers specifically, like Setsuna and Amano, still get a lot of value out of guard cancel, so even in the worst cases, both are still very much viable options. Just goes to show how amazing this meter really is. Thanks for watching my video about a basic resource in a niche fighting game from the 90s for like 10 minutes. Feel free to like and subscribe, our Discord is in the description. We hold Last Blade 2 weeklies on Thursdays, and Samurai Showdown V special weeklies on Sundays, and I'll see you in the next video.